Welcome back to the land of low light, little heat, and no clocks. The church member's worst nightmare. The preacher's bunker, as Marty would put it. No, it's great to have you back for worship in our house on the Lord's Day. And I know you can't see it, but I hope that you'll trust me by faith that I do have a clock positioned, and I intend to follow it at least a little bit better than I did last week. But I appreciate your patience and your positive feedback, and I know what ended up being a little lengthier than normal study. But I'm really looking forward to getting back to our year's theme, God's family fueled by the power of one, and especially the character that we're going to be discussing today, one that has quickly become one of my biblical favorites, the man Nehemiah. But before I talk about the man Nehemiah, I would first like to describe another man, Jim Lovell, who is a former NASA astronaut and a retired captain in the U.S. Navy. He once said there are three types of people in life: those who make things happen, those who watch things happen, and those who wonder what happened. And if you think about it, there's a lot of truth to that there are only a few people in this existence who are real difference makers, those who actually make things happen. Most people are those who just stand by idly and watch things occur. But then there are a few others who are constantly asking, hey, what did I miss? So there really is a lot of truth to that statement. But Mr. Lovell continued, to be successful, he said, you need to be a person who makes things happen. Our month's The Power of One character was a person who made things happen. He was a great success. Nehemiah was a man who was fueled by his passion for God, a drive that led him to rebuild the broken walls of his people. But before we get into the text of the book of Nehemiah itself, I'd first like to give some historical context to our study. Way back in 586 BC, God's people, those of Judah, were carried off into Babylonian captivity. And there were actually three times that this occurred over a 20-year period. And it all began in the year 606 BC. I will state that you'll find at times about a year or two difference in some of these dates. I wouldn't get too excited about that. There is some debate about the exactness of the year, but the general chronological period, for those, there's really no debate that's involved. The first time that God's people were carried away, some of them from Judah into Babylon, was 606 BC. The second one occurred about 10 years later in 597. And then the third one, as we have on the map before us, occurred in 586 BC. Now, about 50 years after the Israelites had become captives of Babylon, a man by the name of Cyrus the Great, leading the Persian Empire, came up against and conquered Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon. And one of the first things that he did as ruler over all these slaves that were then absorbed into his empire is he emancipated them. It's strange that he doesn't get the credit that he deserves, but he was one of the rare good guys among pagan rulers of the world. He had a strong belief in human rights, and he's really the Abraham Lincoln 2,500 years approximately before there was an Abraham Lincoln. And so he issues the edict that is going to free all the slaves, which includes God's people, and that eventually allows them to go back into the land of their ancestors and to begin the rebuilding process of their city. Now, about 100 years after this, there's a man by the name of Artaxerxes I. And if that sounds familiar at all, maybe it rings a bell. The last half of his name, Xerxes, who's also known as Ahasuerus. Xerxes I was the husband of the woman from Scripture that we know as Esther. Well, his third son is this guy, Artaxerxes I, who rules from about 464 to 424 BC, again, which is about 100 years after the proclamation freeing the slaves was made by Cyrus the Great. And so God's people for many decades now have been back in their homeland trying to rebuild their city that is in tatters. But that's when you have Nehemiah, who steps onto the scene. About in the middle of Artaxerxes I, he he's a descendant of these ancestors that about 150 years prior were carried away into Babylonian captivity. His people for around 100 years have been back in his homeland of Judah trying to rebuild the city. And the setting for our story is going to occur approximately in the year 445 BC. And what a daunting task that this man Nehemiah has before him to try to lead God's people to rebuild the fallen walls of Jerusalem. It's such a big challenge that only someone who is genuinely concerned would even attempt such a feat, and that Nehemiah was. We find out more about the man and his vocation in verse 11 at the end of it, which is also the end of the chapter. And Nehemiah says, I was the king's cupbearer. He mentions being in Shushan, the citadel, which is the fortress. It's the command center of the entire Persian Empire, where as well the palace is found. And he says, Hananiah, one of my brethren, came with men from Judah. They come back to the Persian Empire to report about what's going on. And so he says, naturally, I asked him concerning the Jews who had escaped, who had survived captivity, and concerning Jerusalem. And they said to me, the survivors left from the captivity are in great distress and reproach. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down. Its gates are burned with fire. So Nehemiah says, when I heard these words, I sat down, wept, and I mourned for many days. Now I ask you to remember where Nehemiah is and what the job now in life it is that he possesses. I know it doesn't sound like much to be somebody who carries drinks to somebody else. You know, if someone were to ask you in America, what do you do for a living? And you say, well, there's this one guy and I take a drink to him when he's thirsty. We probably wouldn't want to brag about that, right? That doesn't sound like much in America, and I'm not saying that's the same thing as being a waiter or waitress. I think it's a little bit different. Just for one person, I just cater to this individual. It doesn't sound like a very prominent role, but in a monarchy, it is exactly that. And it's really more than, well, there's this guy who's so lazy he doesn't want to go across the room and get his beverage, although there may be some truth to that as well. But what it is Nehemiah is a wine tester for the king. And so he will taste the wine before he gives it to the king to make sure that it hasn't been poisoned. He's almost like a secret service member to the president in America. Okay, he's a really important individual. The king thinks a lot of him because he puts his life on the line every day to help the king. Well, and it just so happens that in being connected to the royal family and essentially being somewhat of a bodyguard for the king, he gets to live in a really nice place. He is a part of the most powerful empire in the world. He's connected to the most powerful family in the world, and he gets to live in a castle on a daily basis. Life is good for Nehemiah. His body is found in Persia in the palace. But we find out in chapter 1 that his heart is located with his brethren in the city that still lies in ruin in Jerusalem. When Nehemiah hears about the condition of his people, even though life's good for him, but he hears what things are like for his brothers and his sisters back home, he breaks down and he cries for many days. And he wants to change this condition, and he knows the perfect person to do so. He goes to God in prayer. Verses 4 through 11 of chapter 1, he says, I was fasting and praying, meaning in the past I was continuing to do that, before the God of heaven. And I said, Lord God of heaven, great and awesome, you who keep your covenant and mercy with those whom you love and those who observe your commandments. Let your ear be attentive and your eyes open, that you may hear the prayer of your servant, which I pray before you. Listen to this, day and night, a persistent prayer. He says, I have sinned. The children of Israel have sinned. We have acted very corruptly. And he says, now, Lord, I pray to you, remember your word that you spoke, that if you'll return to me, and if you'll keep my commandments, those of you who have been cast out from the farthest part of the heavens, yet I will gather them from there. Nehemiah says, here we are, Lord. These are your servants. and your people, whom you have redeemed by your great power and by your strong hand. So please let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant, and let your servant prosper this day, I pray, and grant him mercy in the sight of this man. Man, you read through this, and Nehemiah, that guy, he sure knew how to pray, didn't he? He reminds me yet a little more eloquently, but his attitude, he reminds me of the tax collector in the story that Jesus tells. The tax collector and the Pharisee, and the Pharisee comes before God bragging about himself and all the great things that he's been doing lately, and focusing on how strong he is and how smart he is. And then you have the tax collector who comes before God, and he won't even lift up his eyes to heaven, and he just focuses on his weaknesses and all of his failures, and begs for God's mercy. That's Nehemiah right here. He has the attitude of the tax collector. And I don't doubt that Nehemiah was a really good guy who did most things right in his life. He's having a lot of success, especially when you compare him to other inhabitants, citizens, maybe better stated, of Judah. And yet he comes before God in total humility and not bragging to God about how strong he, that is Nehemiah, is, and about all the successes he's been having. Instead, he brags on how strong God is and all the success that God has. And he says, Lord, I need you to have mercy on us. I need you to help us in this endeavor. Your people are hurting, and you made a promise that if they'll come back to you, that you'll come to rescue them. We need your deliverance right now. And what he says at the end of that prayer, he says, I'm about to do something drastic, Lord, and so I ask you to grant me success in the eyes of this man before whom I'm about to go. That man is not only the most powerful individual in the Persian Empire, it's also the most powerful man in the entire world. It is the Persian emperor. It is Artaxerxes I himself. And Nehemiah is about to go to make an appeal to him to help him so that he can go back to his homeland and aid his people in the rebuilding process. It's going to take a lot of courage for him to do this. And that's for what he has sought the Lord in help. Chapter 2, the first 5 verses, Nehemiah makes sure to wait until wine has been brought before the king, and so he takes and he gives that wine to the king. He said, I've never been sad in his presence before, and there's a reason for that. Among Persian kings, you never brought your drama into their presence. And the reason for that is they have to deal with so much headache all the time. They don't need any extra stress, so you better not bring it before them or your life will be in jeopardy. But this day he brought his drama before the king. The king noticed, and he said to him, why is your face sad since you're not sick? Why, he says, this is nothing but sorrow of the heart. And Nehemiah said, I became dreadfully afraid. He knew now he could pay the price for it. And so he said to the king, may the king live forever. Why should my face, though, not be sad? The place of my father's tombs lies waste. Its gates are burned with fire. And so the king said to me, I'm picking up what you're putting down. Is that right, Bradley? He says, what do you request? So I prayed to the God of heaven again. I think it's probably a mini prayer that he lets loose right here. And I said to the king, if your servant has found favor in your sight, I ask that you send me back to Judah, to the city of my father's tombs. The wisdom of Nehemiah shines forth here, and it could be an answer to the prayer that he made and the wisdom that God granted to him. He first doesn't make request to the king until wine has been set before the king. Now what's going to be the effect of taking a decent amount of wine into the king's system? You see, that's going to put him in a state of mind where he's more relaxed than he normally is, and he might make decisions that are more in Nehemiah's favor that typically he wouldn't tend to make. The next part of this is nothing short of a stroke of genius on Nehemiah's part. He says, I need to go back to my homeland because my ancestors' tombs are in rough shape. We might think, okay, well, why would you bring that up? Well, to the Persians, they're a lot like the Egyptians, and they're very superstitious about the burial chambers of their dead. They take great care of them. They don't ever want them to be in anything less than perfect shape. And so he makes an appeal to the heart of the king. It's the burial chamber of my fathers, O king, that need attended to. and the king would have taken notice of this. And finally, did you notice how he never mentions the city Jerusalem? He just calls it the place. Now he does Judah, the overall country itself, but he never mentions the city of Jerusalem. I believe that's calculated on Nehemiah's part, because it was only a few years earlier that Artaxerxes I had halted all efforts that the Persian Empire was putting into rebuilding the city of Jerusalem. And a couple of years after the fact, that Nehemiah brings that up again. Oh yeah, hey, let's restart the building effort in Jerusalem. He's very unlikely to respond in a positive way to Nehemiah, so he doesn't refer to the city by name yet. He knows exactly what he's doing. Everything about this has been thoroughly thought out, including the very setting itself. Verses 6 through 15. The king said to me, the queen also sitting beside him, how long will your journey be, and when will it be that you'll return? So it pleased the king to send me, and I set him a time. And as he goes through the land, he's given clearance in all these places, and people are told by the king in this letter that Nehemiah has to give him timber and give him this supplies and those supplies to reconstruct everything that's needed in the city, and especially the city wall, so they can protect it from against their enemies. And so the king sends them with an army, with horsemen. But then verse 10, Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite heard of it, and they were deeply disturbed that a man had come to seek the well-being of Israel. Those are the nations that surround Israel, that are being big bullies to her and are pillaging her on a regular basis, because there's no wall, no defense system around the city. And so Nehemiah says, I came to Jerusalem in the night, a few men with me. I told no one what God had put in my heart to do at Jerusalem. And so I went out by night through the valley gate to the serpent well, the refuse gate. I viewed the walls of Jerusalem that were broken down, its gates that had been burned with fire. And then he says, in the night I returned back. Now, a couple of things that we can notice here. One, I really like what's parenthetically stated. He said, I did all this in the king's presence and talked to him with the queen sitting beside him. Our mind just kind of tends to skip over that information. Now, with the Persians, it was like the Jews and like a Christian household, like we studied last week, even in America today, that in a godly household, in the Jews' household, in a Christian household, even in the Persian household, though, the man was the head of the house. Well, the man may be the head of the house, but if the man's the head of the house, the woman is often the neck that turns that head. And I don't mean that as in something that's out of place. I think that's a very biblical concept. A woman, when she becomes married to man, is described in the Bible, Genesis 2, to be a helper to him. And I believe that she is helping her husband make this decision. And Nehemiah knew that would be the case. And so he waits until the queen is in his presence. And he makes the right decision. And probably under the influence of what is meant by that of his wife. Artaxerxes I is the head of his household, but he has a neck that helps turn that head. Well, Nehemiah does, when he returns home, what any good leader would do. He goes out and he inspects the damage firsthand himself to determine what it is that needs to be done. You might recall a few weeks, well, it's been several weeks ago by this point, when we had the strong storms that came through the Nashville area. I'm sure the president had all the information that he really needed, but he showed up and he walked through and he had people point out to him what it was that had happened before he made some final decisions about aid that would be given to help rebuild that area. And that's not unique to President Trump. Our presidents in our country, they always do that kind of thing. But it's what any leader seeking to be a good one ought to do. That's what Nehemiah does. He shows up and he looks through the area to find out what exactly it is that's taken place. And when he realizes how great this task is going to be, and as it's been reported to him, maybe even worse, he knows he can't do it alone. He understands, I'm going to have to motivate the people to get behind me, to help in this effort, else it's never going to get done. So verses 16 through 20, the officials did not know where I'd gone, what I had done. I hadn't told yet all the people, but I said to them, you see the distress that we are in. how Jerusalem lies in waste and its gates are burned with fire. Come, let us build the wall of Jerusalem, that we may no longer be a reproach. And I told them about the hand of my God which had been upon me, and of the king's words that he had spoken to me. So they said, you're exactly right, let's rise up and build. Nobody likes hearing, you're an embarrassment, you're a laughingstock, everybody picks on you. And that's where Nehemiah begins. That's great motivation. And he goes on to say, guys, God has blessed this effort every step of the way already. Did you know the most powerful man in the world, the king of Persia, is behind our efforts? And that gives them the enthusiasm they need. And suddenly Nehemiah's idea becomes their idea. Hey, we need to build this wall. Exactly what Nehemiah was telling them. And so they set their hands to the good work. But Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite, and Geshem the Arab heard of it, and they laughed at them, despised them, and they said, what is this that you're doing? Are you going to rebel against the king? And so I answered them, the God of heaven himself will prosper us. Therefore we, not your, but his servants, will arise and build, but you have no heritage, no right, and no memorial in Jerusalem. Now when we hear that, we say, that's right. It just sounds like a really good comeback. Well, it's actually a lot more than that. What Nehemiah has stated as the leader of God's people right now is of legal ramifications. He essentially has written, signed, and handed over to the enemy Judah's Declaration of Independence. You know, kind of like in our country, when the British were bullying the Americans around, that's when the Declaration of Independence was written, it was signed, and it was delivered to the King of England. And they saw that as an act of treason and war. Well, the enemies of God's people around see it in exactly the same way. Are you going to rebel against the king? Yeah. We're ready to stand up and we're ready to fight for our rights and we're ready to gain our independence from everyone all around us once again. Now this all sounds great, but it means nothing unless it's put into practice. And the time comes for God's people to do exactly that. Chapter 4 verses 1 through 5, when Sanballat, he's a Samaritan by the way, when Sanballat heard we were rebuilding the wall, he, furious, very indignant, mocked the Jews. And before his brethren in the army of Samaria, he said, what are these feeble Jews doing? Will they fortify themselves? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they complete the reconstruction project in a day? Will they revive the stones from the heaps of rubbish? And Tobiah the Ammonite, beside him, you know, they're real tough guys when they're in the presence of one another, beside him said, whatever they build, if even a fox goes up on it, it'll come crashing down, their stone wall. And so Nehemiah turns back to God. And he says, hear, O our God, for we are despised. Turn their reproach on their own heads and give them as plunder to a land of captivity. Do not cover their iniquity. Do not let their sin be blotted out from before you, for they have provoked you to anger. I think his assertiveness inspires the people even more because verse 6 goes on to say, so we built the wall. And the entire wall was joined up together to half its height. Just like that. For the people had a mind to work. Brothers and sisters, when God's people rely on him, and they do everything they can, and they help each other out, and they don't let what anyone says on the inside discourage them, there's no limit to what God's people together by the power of the Lord can accomplish. But that doesn't mean that people on the outside are going to say, oh, okay, well, we give up so easily. Verses 7 through 9, when Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the Ashdodites heard that the walls of Jerusalem were being restored, and the gaps were beginning to be closed, they became very angry. They conspired together to attack Jerusalem and create confusion. Nevertheless, we made our prayer to our God and set a watch against them night and day. Verse 11, our adversaries said, they will neither know or see anything. We'll come into the midst of them, we'll kill them, and we'll cause the work to cease. Now, this isn't a small, localized attack that is threatening Judah. We read about Sanballat, who represents the Samaritans to the north. The Ammonites are found to the east. The Arabs, a large empire at that time, to the south. The people of Ashdod to the west. And then you have this tiny horizontal sliver that's left of the land of God's people. Do you realize that God's people were completely enclosed and they're being squeezed together as in a vice more and more every day? What hope do these people, without a defense even of their city, what hope do they have? It takes a toll on the inhabitants of the land. Verse 10, then Judah said, the strength of our laborers is failing, and there is so much rubbish that we are not able to build the wall. The people are ready to give up. And Nehemiah realizes, okay, I'm at a real crossroads in my leadership of God's people. If I don't do something, I'm about to lose all of them. Morale is terrible right now. I know we haven't had a lot of application in the lesson right up to this point, and that's been by design. I wanted to save that more so to the end. But think about it. You have God's people, and you have holes in the walls of political Jerusalem that need to be filled in, and you have more holes that are being knocked in it by enemies on a regular basis, and they're ready to give up. You know, God's people have a Jerusalem about which they need to be concerned today too. Revelation chapter 21 calls it New Jerusalem in reference to the church. Have you ever experienced among God's people that so much work that needs to be done, so many positive things that can occur, but then there's a hole in the wall over here that happens because there's a brother who's mad at another brother, or a sister who's mad at a sister, or a brother who's mad at a sister, or a sister at a brother because of some problem that happened 7 years ago. And so that needs to be attended to, and this good work over here can't get done. There's all this wonderful teaching that needs to take place, but we can't do that right now because there's some untrue teaching that's started to be circulated among us. There are so many great things that we can do as the Bible teaches us to do, but then there's some pushback because, well, that doesn't make us comfortable on the basis of what we've done for the last 50 to 100 years, even though it was done in Bible times. And that's not even to mention the barrage of attacks that come against God's people from the outside. You ever just throw your hands up? And thankfully, don't misunderstand, we're a part of a great church in Conway. We all understand that. But whether it's somewhere else, or maybe it is something over the last several, maybe it's something that we have experienced at Conway, but if in the church somewhere, somehow, have you ever gotten to the point you're just ready to throw your hands up and you say, I just don't have the energy anymore. All these great things need to be done, but because we're worried about this hole, and we patch that hole, and as we're patching that hole, there are 2 more holes that come. We can never build the wall up, it seems like, to where it needs to go. That's where God's people in Nehemiah's day found themselves. And so Nehemiah knows he needs to do something about morale. Verse 14, I looked, arose. He says, I said to the nobles, to the leaders, to the rest of the people, guys, do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, great and awesome, and fight for your brethren, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your houses. You know, a lot of times in the work God has given us to do, we forget about the powerful force that's behind us. We forget for whom it all is. We too need to remember the Lord in our difficult times. Great and awesome He is. And I hope that has even more meaning to us today than what it had in Nehemiah's time. Remember the Lord, great and awesome. Remember what He did for you and what He did for me. Do you think there was ever a time when those stripes were being laid on Jesus' back? Maybe by the 11th one, He wondered, oh, is this really worth it? Do you think it might have been as He was being beaten in the face with a rod, that maybe after the 3rd or 4th strike, He said, I don't know if I can take much more. But He did, all the way to the death, His death on the cross. And you know why? When things got tough, He thought about you. And He thought about me. When things get hard, remember the Lord, who He is and what it is that He's done for us. And hopefully we never have to go any further than that, but if we do, let's follow Nehemiah's inspired advice, and let's think about one another. If we say, is it really worth it for me? It's not about me. For you, it's not about you. Number one, it's about the Lord. And number two, it's about the Lord's family. As Nehemiah would say, remember your brethren. You know, there have been times, plenty of times in the church, I've wondered, is it really worth it to continue on? And it didn't take too long to consider the Lord and what, for some reason, He thought of me. There have been times I wonder, can you go on anymore? Now, there hasn't been a lot of that at Conway. Again, I want you to know that. But there have been times in my life, can I go anymore? You know what that's like. You've experienced it too. And then I think about you guys. And I think I would die for any one of you. And I know that's a strong statement, but I believe so. I would die for any one of you just like that. And I think, well, if I would really die for you, am I not willing to go through just a little bit of hardship as well for you, with you? And I hope and I thoroughly believe that you would say the same thing about me, because that's the kind of family that we have at Conway. When things get hard and you wonder, do I have any strength left? And you question, is it really going to be worth it in the end? Number one, remember the Lord and how great and awesome He is, and how much He thought of you and how much He thought of me when He went through what He did for us. And number two, remember your brethren. Verses 15 through 20. When our enemies heard that it was known to us, and that God had brought their plot to nothing, all of us returned to the wall, everyone to his work. The motivation that Nehemiah puts before God's people is effective. He says, half of my servants worked at construction, while the other half held the spears, the shields, the bows. They wore armor. Those who built on the wall and those who carried burdens loaded themselves, so that with one hand they worked at construction, and the other they held a weapon. Long days, hard days. Those who built on the wall and those who carried burdens, as we said, that they worked with two hands. Verse 18, every one of the builders had his sword girded at his side as he built. The one who sounded the trumpet, Nehemiah says, was beside me. And so I said to the rulers, the nobles, the rest of the people, the work is great. It's extensive. We're separated far from one another on the wall. Wherever you hear the sound of the trumpet, rally to us there. Our God will fight for us. And so he keeps fueling the passion of these people, just like the desire he has within him. And verse 21 says, so we labored in the work. Half of the men held the spears from daybreak until the stars appeared. And don't you know, those are long work days. They're so tired at night they can't hardly get any sleep. They're mentally exhausted. They're physically spent. But I want to fast forward to chapter 6 as we close in verses 15 and 16. Nehemiah says, but the wall was finished on the 25th day of Elul in 52 days. And it happened when all our enemies heard of it, and all the nations around us saw these things, that they were very disheartened in their own eyes. For they finally got it. They perceived that this work was done by our God. Jerusalem was a city that, while it had been rebuilt in some areas, and there were some good parts about it, it was a city that had no wall, and therefore it was a city that couldn't be defended. And until that wall was built, God's people wouldn't be safe, and God's work that really needed to take place would not fully be done. And so Nehemiah was a man who went into town with a great passion for God and a drive that he would not quit until the work was finished. And by the power of one man, with God's help, he rebuilt the walls of an entire city in less than 2 months. Brothers and sisters, the lesson in it for us is this. Like old political Jerusalem, whether it's at Conway or congregations around us, it's always a concern of New Jerusalem for holes to come in the wall. It may be from the inside, it may be from the outside. There's so much work that needs to be done in God's city, But sometimes it can be hard because in all these good things that need to be done, there's all this bad that first needs to be fixed. And you'll go and you'll fix this bad thing, and as you're fixing it, then another hole gets knocked in the wall. And as you're repairing that one, 2 more holes get knocked in the wall. What Nehemiah shows us is don't give up. Rely on God. Look to each other. Everyone do what he or she can. Stay united as a family as God designed us to be. And in a relatively short time, you're going to see all the holes in those walls repaired. Nehemiah shows us how to repair holes in the wall of a religious people. He also shows us how to repair holes in a wall for a country. I want to give God the credit for this. I planned this a long time ago, and only He could foresee how this would really fit into what it is as a country that we're facing right now. We're a part of a land that currently has a lot of holes in its wall with what we're facing with this virus. And I have every confidence in God that in a relatively short time, things are going to be fine and we're going to move right on. I thoroughly believe that. But in the weeks and the months that follow, we have a country whose walls, so to speak, are going to need to be rebuilt. And it's going to take people at the local level to be leaders and to give people inspiration, to be those who put forth effort behind which others can get and really want to be a part of. And it's easy to sit back and say, hey, whether in the church or our country, someone needs to address that. Yeah, you know who that someone is? It's you. And that someone's me. Are we going to be those who exercise our power to make a difference in our church and in our country? But Nehemiah understood this. If I'm going to have a profound influence on others, and if I'm going to be effective in rebuilding the walls of a religious group and of a country, he knew first I have to rebuild my own walls that have holes in them. Remember in chapter 1, going back to where we started, he comes before God and he tells him this: I've failed you. I've sinned. I have holes in my wall and I need you to repair them. If he's going to be effective in leading others and in rebuilding their walls and collective walls, he first has to rebuild the walls of his own faith. The power of Nehemiah, just one person, to rebuild a whole religious group and a whole country's walls, is the power that lies within every one of us. But only if we first are willing to address and to rebuild the walls of our own faith. Before we go our separate directions, let's bow together in prayer. Father above, we're so thankful for the chance to open up your word. Dear God, we are humbled by how great and how awesome you are. We would love to be anything that's like you, but if we're honest, Father, we're not. You're perfect. We have flaws. You are strong. We are weak. But we thank you that it is that way, and so that we don't have to try to do everything on our own, that we can trust in you and the greatness that you truly do possess. We're thankful for your word. We're grateful for servants of yours like Nehemiah and the others that we've studied, that we see the tremendous power that you put within them, but really the lesson is the tremendous power that you put inside of every one of us. And that we can make such a big difference in this world whenever you're behind us. Father, we can rebuild the walls of churches. We can rebuild the walls of an entire country. But we can't rebuild any walls until we're willing to address those of our own. So we first ask you very humbly, Father, for the forgiveness of the many times that we failed you and for our imperfections. And we ask for your strength to shine through in our weakness. We do pray for our church at Conway. We're so thankful for the immense growth that we've been able to experience, for all the optimism that we have even in difficult times right now because of the power of your Son and because you are with us, and we rely on you in every way, and especially in these. Please continue to bless the efforts of our church. Please keep our spirits high, especially when we're away from one another. Father, we continue to pray for our country. We have holes in our wall, so to speak, right now. Please use us to help rebuild these walls. Please continue to watch over all of your public servants who are sacrificing all to keep us well and healthy. For those who are sick, please heal them speedily. Please help there to be no more deaths if you would allow that to be the case. And for those of us who are not ill, please allow your protective care to keep being over us. And we thank you so very much for that. Please help us to rebuild the walls of our nation. Please help us to rebuild the walls of many churches that have holes in them. Please help us to examine our own congregation at Conway and any breaches that we see in the wall. Give us the courage and help us to know what it is that we need to do to rebuild those walls. Help us to be leaders in that effort. But first remind us and encourage us and empower us to rebuild the walls of our own faith. We're so thankful that we can rely on you. Father, we're so thankful that you give us the opportunity to be exalted, but it's only when we humble ourselves, as we've seen in the perfect example of your Son. And it's by the power of Christ that our words are lifted up to you today. In His name, amen. Well, it's been great to spend some time together in worship again. We love you. We miss you. Please never tire of hearing that, because we mean that from our hearts. It's been great to correspond with many of you through the week in a number of ways. Let's keep that up until we can get together again. Let's continue to look out for and to check on one another. And until next week, when we can't wait for that worship, we look forward to talking to you through the week. We'll see you later.